Hello guys, Joke with a Fool here, back at it again with the 87th episode of the Braxcast, and this is of course going to be covering the third issue of the Great War of Separation. Now, the Great War of Separation was announced at the Rip Reveal in December of 2024. The very end of December was like the last Friday of December, I believe the 27th. But one of the books that got announced was The Great War of Separation with Chuck Dixon and Jack Herbert as the artists. And the first two issues have been released earlier in this year. We got the first issue very early on, I believe like around February or so. And then we got the second issue basically right after that in terms of its pre-order collection. And it got fulfilled sometime in the spring, if I'm remembering correctly. And now the third issue, of course, a couple months between the launches of the second and third issue, but this third issue is going to be in a pre-order collection for the rest of the year, it seems, about another 40 days, and then it will be fulfilling in the first quarter of 2026. I imagine it's not going to take that much time for it to get fulfilled. And like I said, this is a 4-issue miniseries that narrates one of the foundational events of the Rippaverse. Of course, the Great War of Separation is something that we as the fans knew about. It was mentioned on Brian Solari's Dokuman card, so it's something we knew about from the first issue of Isom, the first book that was released, because the first set of Dokuman cards came alongside that first issue of Isom. And of course, it is alluded to in Isom 2 very briefly when Gooding and Isom are talking about the Great War of Separation, although they don't really say all that much about it. But now we know a lot more about it because we've got the first two issues of the Great War of Separation. This third issue is on the way. And of course, we'll most likely get the fourth issue sometime soon. So we'll probably have the fourth issue in our hands, and this series will be done before June of next year with the rate that they are releasing these, which is honestly really fantastic to see. I love how they're keeping up with this. This is going to be a 64-pager, so all in all, it's going to be a little bit over 200 pages or so of story. Excuse me, as Chuck Dixon had mentioned when he was working on this before it was announced, and he did something really big for the Rippaverse, and this is, of course, the big thing. Of course, before we go and cover some of what I like about the Great War of Separation, let's go over the covers. We've got cover A here by Will Conrad and James Frank as the colorist, and this is, of course, a new Accept team. Will Conrad is the artist on Gooding the Polymath. He did the art for the Dokuman cards, and of course, he was the artist of Bone God for Saints and Sinners, and he brings all of that fantastic skill and expertise to this cover right here. This is, of course, like I said, a new Accept team. Very nice to see this as the A cover. This is a really good, like, action team shot. I gotta absolutely love it. Might be one of the best covers of the four that we're going to go over. But it is always hard for me to not have a deep place in my heart for the retro covers, especially when it's done by a talented Enrique Pina, and of course Marcos Martins is the colorist on this. And I love these retro covers, not just because you got the Rippaverse Code of Ethic here, you got the classic character box, of course, with that young Brian Solari. But I love these text boxes here because they give us more insight into what the book is going to introduce while it's in that pre-order phase. So you've got the first appearance of Tigray and Ronnie Dodge, and then you've got Blitz, Dervish, Kirks, and Mulaney, Decate, Dansdora, Takazio, and Mobasa. I imagine this character is Mobasa, some sort of like cyber gorilla, except it's going to be a really interesting story to see. Of course, this character is in the jungle, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be any jungle scenes in this Great War of Separation number 3, because, as you know, excuse me, American comic books are very famous for not having scenes that show up in the interior pages as the cover art, and the Rippaverse has been no stranger to this. Just look at Alpha Core 1 cover B that was done by Jack Herbert, who is the interior artist for Great War of Separation, and that showed a showdown between Lilian Renashi and Ingrid Valdez, which, while it looked really cool, and it still looks really cool, it never happened in the first issue of Alpha Core, even though that is most likely going to be happening at some point in the future. It just has not happened quite yet. Next, we've got the C cover, which is the foiled and embossed cover. So this cover is done by Kane White, and I think this is probably one of the more epic covers. Of course, this is a completely naked cover. You don't have the title card here. You don't have the first issue there. You just got Kane White's little watermark, and you've got this really good, really epic design here. I always love designs where you've got like this, like, you know, conflict, not conflict, but just like one half, you know, one face, another half like the other. Of course, you've got Brian Solari, who's got, you know, completely shaved, the military style. And of course, you've got that classic, like, Superman-esque haircut that he has for basically most of his appearances, because most of his appearances have been him as the Alpha Corps, and he hasn't had to be quite so clean-shaven while working as a super cop in the Alpha Corps, rather than being General Brian Solari. So it is really interesting to see this, like, you know, divide of the character here, and it might kind of imply that we'll see maybe Brian Solari grow his hair out and just be like a little bit less military, although I think Kanan just drew this because it looks really cool, and it certainly does. And Marcos was the colorist on this, Marcos Martins, who's a fantastic colorist. I believe was the colorist for Zalen, and that's probably some of the best color work I've seen, not just in the Rippaverse, but comics in general, even though I'm not the most well-read comic book guy, so that probably means very little coming from me. But this is the foiled and embossed cover. This is a fantastic cover to pick, and I absolutely love that you just don't have any Great War Separation logo, and you just let this art really just dominate the cover, which is, I think, a very good creative choice there. And last, but certainly not least, we've got cover D. This is done by Kane White, who colored and drew this, and is, of course, showing Harriet Silman in like a Rosie the Riveter pose. Of course, you got her behind like a Lone Star emblem. Kind of looks like the Captain America shield, but that certainly is the Lone Star emblem. And you've got this like destructive civilian scene. So it's showing, you know, this idea that of the home front in conflict, but yet you've got this very hopeful message here, which was kind of the point of the Rosie the Riveter propaganda. So it is emblematic of that. It definitely feels like wartime propaganda, and this is kind of the point of the Great War Separation. As you know, I was talking about in the live stream yesterday. If you watched that, I was talking a lot about like actual geopolitics in the state of the military, and I got onto that topic because the Great War Separation has a lot of geopolitical relevance, and the fact that Chuck Dixon uses things that could definitely happen, or actually do happen in real life, and then applying them to this fantastical superhero story. And he does it very masterfully, which is one of the reasons why the Great War Separation is doing as well as it is among the fans, in my opinion. Certainly why I had such high opinions of it when I reviewed the first two issues, and I would say most likely when I review the third issue and the fourth issue, that opinion will maintain, because I cannot see Chuck Dixon not maintaining the momentum and the mastery of the plot that he has had in these first issues. But we'll get into some of my like highlights of the story. Of course, we've got this character here. We've got a bunch of characters that are being introduced in this story. Of course, I do love to see these like big spreads. Jack Herbert has a very good way of just setting up pages, of having the layout be most engaging to the viewer. If you watch my episode of Braxcast where I went over the art of Jack Herbert, the way he talks about how he lays out the art, how he presents the story to the reader is very masterfully done. And this is just a big example of that. This is supposed to be a climactic scene. And of course, you can see the, you know, what's happening in general. And then you got this big spread. And I imagine you're going to have some lettering that really gives some climactic dialogue, or maybe not. Definitely see what happens, but I imagine this is going to be the opening of the book, and then a lot of this is going to be dealing with the fallout. And of course, like I said, you see geopolitical concepts here, and more or less stuff that could happen in reality. Of course, you see Lone Star slaughter, war crime, 200 prisoners executed on the INN news network, and I think having stuff like that, this stuff feels like, well, this is stuff that would happen like in real life, and is being applied to a story where you've got like superpowered military units fighting each other. And of course, you're going to have a fallout over that. Of course, you've got Jacob Silman, I believe here. He's going to be a lieutenant. It's going to be pretty instrumental to the story. Of course, in the second issue, you see Jacob leaving his family to go to the front lines, to fight the Great War of Separation. And then, of course, you have one of those climactic scenes where Harriet and Avery are fending off the accepts from the United States government. And that was a really, really well done scene. And it's one of the things that I cite when I say that Jack Herbert really ought to be attached to a Young Isom series. But that is neither here nor there, because I've ranted about that plenty of times. But to really drive the point back to the Great War Separation #3, this is really just showing that there's going to be a great focus on the grittiness and the war aspect of this comic book. So, of course, you're going to have the superhero aspects. Of course, you're going to have characters like Absolute Zero, Brian Solari flying around, and of course, Zeno is most likely going to make an appearance, and we're going to have Mobasa and all that, fantastical, superpowered action. But it's going to be in the context of this messy geopolitical war story, which I think is the more interesting part of this book, and the fact that it's being told in that context makes it even more interesting, which is one of the reasons, like I said, the Great War of Separation is such an interesting story, and I'm so glad it's being told at this point in the Rippaverse, because we really need that foundational lore to be built. And honestly, we need what happened beforehand, because of course, you got Bromhouse, you got Greater Florida, you've got the Midwestern Alliance, if I'm saying that correctly. So you got a bunch of countries that exist in the North American continent, and we need to know how they formed as well before Texas became its own country. So there's certainly more lore to be built that happened before the Great War of Separation, but for now, this is going to give the fans a really good foundation for the Rippaverse and really inform the context of stuff that's happening in the current timeline. We're talking about like Isom 1, Yaira 1 happening around basically the same time, because Yaira 1 opens with the time where just after Yaira told Avery to stop falling, or after chucking him onto that car, which is probably one of the most well-known scenes of the Rippaverse, right? But anyways, that is to say that there certainly is a lot of lore that has been thought of for the Rippaverse, and the Great War of Separation is definitely one of those big events. But there's stuff that happened before it, and of course there's stuff that happened after it, in between the Ill-Advised arc. So there's just a lot of stuff to cover. There's a lot of stuff to get established, but this is definitely giving a good foundation to build either backwards in the timeline or forwards in the timeline. And I think that's definitely a really good way to go about it. And I'm really excited to see how the third issue goes, and pretty anxious to get that fourth issue as well and have the entire story told to us, because like I said, it's going to give us a lot of information about the foundation of the Rippaverse, and I think it's definitely one of the best places to start if you're looking to get into the Rippaverse. But that is all I have for you guys today. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this episode. Joker is out.
Thank you for tuning in to the Braxcast. Be sure to like, comment, follow, and subscribe to keep up with the Rippaverse.